Welcome to the Lawyerist Podcast with Sam Glover and Aaron Street. Each week, Lawyerist brings you advice and interviews to help you build a more successful law practice in today's challenging and constantly changing legal market. And now, here are Sam and Aaron.
Hi, I'm Sam Glover.
And I'm Aaron Street, and this is episode 147 of the Lawyerist Podcast, part of the Legal Talk Network. Today we're talking with deaf-blind civil rights lawyer and accessibility advocate Haben Girma about accessible justice.
Today's podcast is sponsored by Ruby Receptionists and its smart, charming receptionists who are perfect for small firms. Visit callruby.com/lawyerist to get a risk-free trial with Ruby.
Today's podcast is also sponsored by Clio Legal Practice Management Software. Clio makes running your law firm easier. Try it today for free at clio.com. So, Sam, we had the privilege of seeing Haben keynote the Clio Cloud Conference in New Orleans this fall and instantly knew that we needed to have her on the podcast to talk more in depth about some of these topics. We've talked a little bit in the past about accessibility as it relates to law firm websites and client experience and intake. And I think it'd be worth spending a couple of minutes here before the interview kind of refreshing how practices in accessibility can relate to better design overall for everyone.
Yeah, Haben and I talk a little bit about this, but I think it's really worth emphasizing. I mean, Microsoft has a theory on this that they employ in their design, and I think it's really aware of just the advantages that you can have by designing for people who are disabled. And the theory is that people who are disabled have more challenges moving through the world day to day, that they've already solved most of the problems that the rest of us have. And so in designing things for people who are disabled, you're probably solving problems for everyone else too. And that turns out to be true again and again and again. You're listening to this through the medium of a variety of devices that were all built with accessibility first in mind.
Absolutely, whether that's your iPhone with a whole set of accessibility features or on the website.
Phones, keyboards, microphones, all of that stuff was built for disabled people first.
Yep. We transcribe every episode of this podcast so that there is an alternate text version of it.
Yep.
And those might help people with disabilities access the content in this podcast. But the reality is, regardless of whether you have a disability or not, you might prefer the text transcript of this. And It makes it easier for Google to know what's in this podcast so that if you're searching for this topic, it makes it easier to find. So there are lots of ancillary benefits to pursuing things that are good for some people that make them good for lots of people.
And I think I want to say this again and again. It is not that difficult. I know that it feels daunting because it feels like you're trying to put accessibility on things or you need to go out and reach out to a consultant who will make your stuff accessible. But really, it's just about the stuff you ought to be doing anyway. And so in hiring somebody to optimize your on-page SEO for your website, you're probably also nailing 98, 99% of the things that you need to do to make it accessible. So it's stuff you ought to be doing anyway, and it's not that hard. I think once you dig into it, you'll find that it's a lot less difficult than you may be worried it is. And so there's no reason to delay. Make it so.
And today's conversation is not with Haben, is not an SEO conversation.
No.
But it's fascinating how a conversation about how to make justice more accessible for people with disabilities can have SEO and marketing implications.
Right. It's
and
super neat.
It's a really cool topic.
So here's my conversation with Haben. And just at the beginning, we're going to leave in the delay while Haben's translator types my questions for her to respond. I just want you to get a feel for the way the conversation flowed, and then we'll start cutting out the typing so that it flows a little more quickly. So here's the conversation. Okay, go ahead and introduce yourself.
My name is Haben Girma. I work as a disability rights lawyer, public speaker, and author. I teach organizations about the value of disability. Disability can be an asset to a community and organization, and it's a matter of learning about how to be accessible and what are the different things we can do as a community to make sure our websites, our apps, our facilities are welcoming to everyone.
Haben, thank you so much for being with us on the podcast today. Maybe we should start by talking about how we talk about disability. What are some of the words that we should be using when we need to distinguish between people who are disabled and people who aren't, and just discussing disability in general?
The words I prefer using are disabled and non-disabled. A lot of people, well, some people are not comfortable using the word disability, but I'm comfortable using the word disability. The word disability, for me, is associated with civil rights because of the Americans with Disabilities Act, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, and other civil rights protections that use the word disability. So maybe in this podcast we can use disability and non-disabled.
That sounds good. I'll do that. On your website, you have a frequently asked questions that starts with some messages that we should avoid when talking about people who have disabilities. And I want you to tell us a little bit more about those messages and why we should avoid them.
There's several messages to keep in mind. One message is when we talk about disability, we should avoid trying to judge people with disabilities as existing to help non-disabled people feel grateful that they don't have disabilities.
Yeah.
So often stories in the press will describe people with disabilities as inspiring non-disabled people to stop complaining. You know, like, you have no excuse. Disabled person did this. Therefore, non-disabled people should feel shame that they're not able to do this. That's not fair. That's disrespectful. It's still stigmatizing a group when you're using them to shame another group. I don't want disability to be used to inspire shame in anyone. The interesting thing about the disability community, it's the largest minority group, and it's a group that anyone can join at any time. Our bodies are always changing. As we grow older, change is a natural part of growing older. And at every stage in our life, we deserve dignity, inclusion, and access to everything. So it's really, really important to respect those of us who are different, rather than categorizing us as an other and stigmatizing. We should instead be welcoming to everyone, because it's not really us versus them. We're all going to change. We're all going to be different at some point.
It sounds like part of the danger is in thinking that disability is something unlucky that happens to just a few people, when really you could almost look at it as a spectrum that we all sit somewhere on it.
Exactly. And there are actually a lot of people with disabilities. In the United States, there are about 57 million Americans with disabilities. And throughout the world, there are about 1.3 billion people with disabilities. That's a significant population. So when companies choose to be inclusive, they get to tap into this large market. It's good business to be inclusive because you get more customers, a larger audience. That means more business, more revenue in the long run.
So when we talk about people with disabilities, we're talking about, I think, roughly a fifth of the population, which is a huge chunk.
Exactly. And we may also be talking about our future selves.
And I think, though, a lot of people who don't think of themselves as having disabilities or who don't fall into that don't really understand how to empathize with the problems faced by people with disabilities in just moving around the world. Maybe you could tell us a little bit about your journey to becoming a lawyer so that we understand how that has played out in the law school and law experience that you've had.
I'm deafblind. Most of this world is not designed to be accessible for people who are deafblind. So I've faced many barriers, but my disability is not a problem. The problem is the way the world is designed. People can choose to provide information in multiple formats, or they can choose to provide information only in one format. People can choose to design a building to have ramps and elevators so that people who use wheelchairs have access, or they could choose to only have stairs and deny access to people who use wheelchairs. So when there are barriers, it's not the disability that's the problem. The problem is the design and the choices that people make.
I really like that way of thinking about it, and thanks for that clarification. The world is a design problem, and we've only designed it for some of the population.
Exactly. Most schools are not accessible. I was very, very lucky. I grew up in the San Francisco Bay Area, which happens to be the heart of the disability rights movement. The city of Berkeley was one of the first cities to have curb cuts so that wheelchair users can independently move from sidewalk to sidewalk and cross streets and travel around a city. A lot of disability rights access changes happened first in the San Francisco Bay Area, and I grew up here. So I benefited from many of these changes, and I benefited from having teachers and going to schools that valued inclusion. So I had people telling me, yes, you can. I had people getting me all the materials I need in accessible formats. So I had access to school. I was able to learn math, science, English. If I'd grown up 2 hours outside the Bay Area in other parts of California or in a different state in the United States, I probably would not have been able to get an education and go to college, and definitely not go to law school. I know of other deafblind students in California who missed part of elementary school and middle school because the school refused to provide Braille materials, or they refused to provide interpreters. And the parents and students spent all their energy trying to advocate for access when they could have been learning. So there's still so much unfairness here in the United States and limited access to materials. And we need to change that. We need to make sure everyone has access to an education.
One of the things that you've talked about before is just pointing out how many innovations that we all use came to us by way of designing for disability. What are some of your favorites?
A lot of the technologies we use have been designed or inspired by people with disabilities. These stories are hidden. Very few people know about them. And I think it would be beneficial to get these stories out there and have more people learn about the stories. One example is Vint Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet, is hearing impaired. And before the internet existed as we know it today, deaf people didn't have an easy way to communicate long distance. Vint Cerf found that by sending electronic messages, electronic mail, he could communicate long distance with people without having to strain to hear on the telephone. And this benefits everyone. Email benefits everyone. Lots of people use email now. So that's an example of how something that helps the disability community, a solution inspired by disability, often has benefits for the whole world.
And I think when Vint Cerf was using the internet over the phone lines were also designed by Alexander Graham Bell to overcome his either his hard of hearing or his wife's difficulty in hearing, wasn't it?
Yes. So Alexander Graham Bell did a lot of research to try to find ways to help deaf individuals communicate. And through that process, he ended up developing a telephone. So that's another example of how disability, when you see disability as a design challenge and design solutions, often these solutions benefit the entire community. So investing in hiring people with disabilities and making your businesses accessible drives innovation. You're more likely to have a more innovative workforce if you include people with disabilities. People who think differently are more likely to come up with innovative solutions. Diverse teams are stronger teams.
You've mentioned before that, and maybe this is just what you're getting at, but In designing things for people who have disabilities, you're probably solving problems for the world at large by doing that. And so by designing your firm or your business around accessible principles, you're probably building a more client-friendly firm for everyone.
Exactly. And wouldn't everyone want more clients? Wouldn't you want to be able to tap into the largest market possible? Another thing to keep in mind is that the Americans with Disabilities Act prohibits discrimination against people with disabilities. There are also other laws, state laws, and federal laws that prohibit discrimination against people with disabilities. So access is a right, and it's really important for everyone to invest in inclusion.
As a civil rights lawyer, I imagine you have a much clearer window into some of the ways that access to justice is harder for people with disabilities. What are some of those challenges that those of us who aren't dealing with disabilities on a day-to-day basis may not be aware of?
Some of the barriers that exist in terms of access to justice are physical. So courthouses, meeting spaces that are not wheelchair accessible, designing access to people who use wheelchairs. And that could be lawyers who use wheelchairs. It could be judges who use wheelchairs. It could be clients who use wheelchairs. There is a lot of information online regarding legal services, and often information online is not accessible. The vast majority of websites and apps have access barriers. So we need people in the legal field to ensure that their websites and digital information is provided in accessible formats. The Web Content Accessibility Guidelines teaches people how to design websites to be accessible. For mobile apps, Apple and Android accessibility guidelines teach people how to design them to be accessible.
Haben, have you had a chance to visit lawyerist.com? I'm wondering how well we've done.
No, I haven't had a chance to visit it yet.
We have tried to design it around those accessibility principles, and it's not really that hard. And it turns out that a lot of those things that you would do to build an accessible website are the kinds of things that Google would like you to do to optimize for search engines. Because it turns out Google is also deaf and blind.
That's a good point. When people make their services accessible, it increases content discoverability. So accessibility, some of the things that are necessary to do to make sure services are accessible online is to make sure you have text labels for images, for buttons, and when you increase the text associated with your content, you also help with search engine optimization. Those are things to keep in mind. Access benefits you in multiple ways.
One of the things you mentioned when I heard you speak at the Clio Cloud conference is that you have to be aware of trying to put accessibility on your app or your website or your building at the end. Can you say a little bit more about why that's a problem to try and add accessibility?
It's much harder to try to add accessibility at the end of the design process. It's much easier to plan for it from the start. An example we often use is to compare to building a skyscraper. To ensure wheelchair access, a skyscraper needs an elevator. It's much harder to build the skyscraper without an elevator. And then once you're done building the skyscraper, to add an elevator afterwards. That's more costly, time-consuming, takes more resources. It would be easier and cheaper to design the skyscraper to have an elevator. Put it in the plans. Same thing with digital accessibility. If you plan for it from the start, it's easier to do.
It sounds to me like accessibility needs to be part of the lens through which you see the world and see the design problems and your client service delivery methods.
Yeah, accessibility needs to be prioritized. Make sure your websites are accessible. Have your designers look at the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines and design the website based on those principles. It also helps with search engine optimization. Also, keep in mind that there have been a lot of lawsuits these past few years regarding digital accessibility. I worked on one of those cases. It was a case called National Federation of the Blind versus Script. Script is a digital library, and blind individuals wanted to be able to read books on the library. The way the library was designed, though, created barriers for blind readers, and blind readers can read books on Script. Script tried to argue that the Americans with Disabilities Act doesn't apply to online businesses. The judge in that case looked at our arguments and agreed with us and said that the Americans with Disabilities Act does apply to online businesses like Script. And Script and other online businesses need to adhere to the Americans with Disabilities Act. So that was an exciting, rewarding case to be involved with. And it's something that a lot of organizations need to keep in mind.
So a bit of a stick and a bit of a carrot.
Hey, Sam, can we take a few minutes break? My dog is crying.
Yes, of course. This podcast is supported by Ruby Receptionists. As a matter of fact, Ruby answers our phones at Lawyerist, and my firm was a paying Ruby customer before that. Here's what I love about Ruby. When I'm in the middle of something, I hate to be interrupted, so when the phone rings, it annoys me, and that often carries over into the conversation I have after I pick up the phone, which is why I'm better off not answering my own phone. Instead, Ruby answers the phone, and if the person on the other end asks for me, a friendly, cheerful receptionist from Ruby calls me and asks if I want them to put the call through. It's a buffer that gives me a minute to let go of my annoyance and be a better human being during the call. If you want to be a better human being on the phone, give Ruby a try. Go to callruby.com/lawyerist to sign up, and Ruby will waive the $95 setup fee. If you aren't happy with Ruby for any reason, you can get your money back during your first 3 weeks. I'm pretty sure you'll stick around, but since there is no risk, you might as well try.
Imagine what you could do with an extra 8 hours per week. You could invest in marketing your firm, you could spend more time helping clients in need, or you could catch your daughter's soccer game. That's how much time legal professionals save with Clio, the world's leading practice management software. With Clio, tracking time, billing, and matter management are fast and easy, giving you more time to focus on what really matters. And Clio is a complete practice management platform with plenty of tools and over 50 integrations to help you automate daily tasks such as document generation and court calendaring. See how the right software can make it easier to manage your practice. Try Clio for free today at Clio.com.
Sorry about that, Sam. Thank you for your patience.
Oh, of course. My dog is currently enjoying our freezing cold weather here in Minneapolis.
Wow. My dog, so when I lived in Boston, we had to deal with snow, and she hated snow. She would refuse to go to the bathroom when it started snowing because she didn't like snow on her ground.
My dog is a husky, so my challenge is getting him to even come inside.
Oh, husky. Those are beautiful.
He is very fuzzy.
Did you grow up in Minnesota?
I didn't. I grew up in Virginia, Panama, and the Dominican Republic.
Wow. That's a fun and exciting childhood.
It sure was.
Did you go surfing in the DR?
I was in second and third grade, so I don't think I got past a boogie board level. But it was very cool. It's one of my favorite places in the world.
Yeah, I went there for a wedding and it was amazing. And the staff were super friendly. Oftentimes when I go into a restaurant here in the United States, the staff stare, but they don't really ask questions. In the Dominican Republic, I remember when I was in restaurants, waiters would come up and ask, "What is this? What are you doing?" But not in a mean way, just in a friendly, curious way. And I just explain that it's a keyboard and braille display. People type on the keyboard, I read in digital braille. And I let them try it. And they typed in Spanish, and I know basic Spanish. I studied Spanish in high school and college. So, hola, ¿cómo estás? I was able to read that and respond back.
Very cool. It seems like one of the challenges is people who don't want to engage because they're shy or uncomfortable asking questions or approaching you.
Yeah, I love questions. There's nothing wrong with asking questions. I don't mind if people ask me questions about disability. The thing to keep in mind is your intentions. It's more about attitude. if someone uses the wrong word, I'm not going to get offended. But if they have a pitying and disrespectful attitude, I'm not going to be happy. So it's more about their intentions, how they approach a situation. Is it friendly, respectful curiosity, or is it pitying, questioning, implying that you don't belong, it should leave their establishment? So it's really about their intentions and attitude. When people come up and ask questions, I'm happy to explain. Deaf blindness is rare. I don't expect people to know about deaf blindness. My parents didn't understand deaf blindness. They hadn't heard of Helen Keller or Braille. My parents are from Eritrea and Ethiopia. So they were learning a whole new system. The American culture, our system here, and improving their English, in addition to learning about disability access, Braille, the civil rights movement, that sort of thing. So I'm used to people not knowing, and I don't mind teaching and explaining, as long as people are respectful and kind when they ask.
It sounds like a lot of the solution to inclusion and to increasing accessibility is to include at the beginning of every process, whether it's creating a business or a building or meeting a new person, to favor inclusion rather than getting to it later.
Yeah, plan for it from the start. Make it a priority before you build something, whether it's a new building, a website, an app, a program. Take the time to plan about accessibility. How can you make sure everyone in your community is welcome? And if you're not sure, do the research. Look up the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines. Engage with the disability community. There may be disability organizations in your area. If not, you could tap into national networks. You can contact disability rights experts. Like myself, you can reach me. I have a website, habengirma.com. I'm also on social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and people can find and follow me there. So reach out to people if you don't know the answers. Definitely start asking questions with the intention of trying to welcome everyone.
And I think what people will find as they try to open up their practices, their websites, the court system, is that it's actually not as hard as it seems like it might be once you get started.
Exactly. It's really not as hard as it seems. Oftentimes, disability access needs are free, simple, easy. The vast majority of people with disabilities can explain what they need, and if you ask, people can help point you in the right direction of what you need to do. Sometimes it's being flexible, maybe moving a meeting place from an inaccessible spot to an accessible spot. Maybe it's just moving furniture a little bit to create more room. Maybe it's bringing in an interpreter. Maybe it's switching from telephone to email, or using a chat service that provides access. So just being flexible about how you communicate, where you communicate, will allow you to connect with more people.
That sounds awesome. I hope that lawyers who are listening are starting to think about ways that they can bring that fifth of the country who is disabled in and help them find legal services and make them clients.
I strongly encourage everyone to think of this as a business opportunity. It's not charity. It's good business for all of us to be inclusive, because you get to tap into a larger market. Sam just said it's 1/5 of the population, 57 million Americans with disabilities. That's a significant market. So it benefits all of us to be inclusive.
Haben, thank you so much for being with us today. I really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you for spotlighting inclusion, Sam, and creating the opportunity to teach more people about disability access.
Make sure to catch next week's episode of the Lawyerist podcast by subscribing to the show in your favorite podcast app. And please leave a rating to help other people find our show. You can find the notes for today's episode on lawyerist.com/podcast.
The views expressed by the participants are their own and are not endorsed by Legal Talk Network. Nothing said in this podcast is legal advice for you.